Welcome back to Communicology. What right do you have to anything in this world? Anything? Well, before we get into that, if you would, please take the moment to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to comment on the video too if you have any thoughts. Let's jump into today's discussion, and I want to talk about the difference between wants, needs, and rights. It's not very uncommon that while you're watching TV or scrolling through social media, you'll see about some kind of protest where people are marching through the streets talking about their rights, their right to this, their right to that, to whatever. And we often think, well, what exactly is a right? How do we get it? How does that vary versus a need? How does that vary versus a want? Well, sometimes it could be a little bit complicated, especially when you talk about how they come to be and who grants them. So let's talk about that today and discuss that. So the next time you say, I want something, or I need something, or I have the right to something, that we're using the proper term and that we understand what those terms mean, especially what they mean to us and what they mean to other people. Now, wants are fairly straightforward. They're things that, well, that you want, something that you would desire to have. Something that is not required for your survival, something that is an added benefit. And that could be something as simple as instead of having bread, you want bread with jam on it. Instead of, having a basic, cup of water, you want a pop or a soda, depending on where you are in the country. These are things that they're not needed. They're not necessary for for what we absolutely have to have. And it's just those things that we would love to enjoy if we were given the opportunity. So you think of all your wants that you have. Vacations. I want to go on a vacation. I mean, why not? I mean, where would you go? If you could snap your fingers and go somewhere, where would you go? I mean, that's clearly a want. You don't need to be there. What about things like all of our latest tech gadgets, the newest toy that comes out, and all the other things like a new car or a new house or a new bicycle or whatever that you might fancy? Again, those are things that we want. We don't have any great life issue if we don't get those. We can continue moving along just fine without them. So, thinking about that vacation, that cruise, going out to dinner, those kind of things, they all fit into things that we want. But when it comes to needs, that's when things kind of kick into a different kind of, mindset. These are things that are required for our survival. And you think of even like the most basic level, you're looking at things like air, water, food, shelter, clothing, sleep, things like that. I mean, those are things that you need. You cannot go without, and some of you can go without for a little while. Like if you didn't drink any water, you can go for quite a while without water, days, but you'll eventually have effects of dehydration and eventually, death. If you go without food, you can go days, depending, on your storage reserves. You might be able to make it a week or two, and maybe even longer. But then eventually your body's going to start shutting down, and death will come. So you get the point. I mean, air, you need air pretty well regularly all the time. I mean, you can go without air. You can hold your breath for a little while, but it's going to be in the terms of seconds, maybe a minute or two, and then you're going to find death. So these things we need. Even things like sleep. If you try going without sleep, I mean, you could make it days without sleeping. And eventually, your body's going to shut down because it needs sleep. It needs to recharge. And of course, you look at things like clothing and shelter. Those are also common things that people think, well, do you need it? Well, I mean, depending on where you are in the world, if you're in some exotic place where you can just lay out and it doesn't rain or it doesn't have any kind of issues, You could lay out there and enjoy it, but you are at the whim of the weather and also any kind of wild beasts or intruders that come your way. And clothing, I mean, in some environments, sure, you could spend time being naked and living free, but the problem, of course, comes with any kind of change in weather, the effects of the sun. Clothing protects you not just from things like cold, but also from, dangerous effects of heavy sun usage and sun cancer, skin cancers, things like that. So again, those are things that you need. And if you live in a northern climate, like I was born and raised in Western Pennsylvania, you better have clothing. You better have shelter, because it's cold in the winter and it rains a lot in the summer. So you get used to the joy of clothing and shelter. Now, you can see the difference between needs and wants pretty clearly right there, because when it comes down to the idea of moving from a need to a want, yes, shelter is important. How nice of a house? Because a tent is shelter, but wouldn't it be better to live in a bigger tent? If you've ever gone camping and you had a little small tent, one of the first things you start thinking is, I wish I had a bigger tent. Why? Well, you have all the extra gear in there. Maybe if you want to get changed and it's a small tent, it's hard to get changed in there. So if you get changed outside, and that's uncomfortable and not fun. So you get a bigger tent, and then next thing you know, you wish you had a bigger tent. And next thing you know, you're thinking, why don't I just buy a small camper? And next thing you know, why don't I buy a tow behind RV type thing, and then the drivable, the large like Class A RVs, those huge ones that are bigger than school buses. The next thing you know, you're just, I just like a house and then a mansion, and there's no need for those things. A tent is shelter. We want what's beyond that. Clothing, a loincloth or a robe is clothing. But if we want a nice shirt or a pair of jeans or whatever, then we start moving into the neighborhood of wants. What do I want? And this is the tension area between these two, where you can find out truly where you are in life. Are you content? And contentment can easily be found in that beautiful gap between needs and wants, because you can see how quickly it flips from a need to a want. Because just having a robe, living in a tent, eating bread and drinking water, your needs are fairly well covered. Anything beyond that is a want. How far does your list go for something that I want? And you can all of a sudden start feeling that pull of am I a content person, or do I want to have things beyond my typical needs and move into luxuries? Now, I'm not here to shame you for wanting to have a nice car or to have a nice house or to have nice clothes. That's between you and your conscience and your maker of how far down the road you get, especially when you start looking at the idea of swinging the whole other way and going towards covetousness and wanting what other people have. That's a different kind of thing. But again, the difference between the needs and the wants is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of your own personal desire. How far into that wants category do you go? Most people don't want to recognize that a need is as insanely basic as a tent, a robe, water, and a loaf of bread. After that, you're really looking into the want territory, and people think, well, I need this, and I need this, and I need this. And we talk about that all the time. Like, I need to go to the grocery store to buy, and you name all these groceries. Like, we don't need them. I mean, to get to the grocery store to actually buy them, yes, you need to go. You can't just snap your fingers and they magically show up. Although you can order them online. But nonetheless, you still, have a need to buy food. You have a need to buy clothing. But we tend to conflate those two. We get used to things and comfortable with things, or we start saying, this is actually a need now, when it's actually a want. I need the newest iPhone. I need the newest fill in the blank, whatever the thing happens to be. And again, we're talking about want. So that's a dangerous line to cross, and we should always be careful not to swing too far that way. Now, when it comes to looking at needs there were, you look at like Maslow and his hierarchy of needs and things like that. He blurred the line pretty well with his work, and this is not by any means anything I necessarily subscribe to. It's something I want to just discuss. But he broke needs down to a couple different things, and he looked at the idea of what's called deficiency needs, what he called D needs. Deficiency needs, these are something that we need to survive. Obviously, the things like food, clothing, shelter, the things we've already discussed. Then he also broke it down to what's known as growth needs, and these are called B needs. But basically, you're looking at these are things that we need to achieve our goals, to feel fulfilled, to achieve happiness. Now, obviously, you can feel the tension instantly that, wait a minute, aren't these things wants? So, this is where I think I wrestle a bit with Maslow and go from there. So he looks at things like love, belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization. And again, you start looking at these kind of things and start wondering, well, wait a minute, are these things needs? Are these things wants? Well, you look at the idea of belonging. And we have talked about this before in other videos, that the idea of, you go back in Genesis into the mandate of creating man and woman. And God said, man is not meant to be alone. It is not good for man to be alone. Boom, and creates woman. That's a sense of belonging. We are meant to be together. And you also talk, you see the idea of looking at like Aristotle calling us social animals. And the idea of, well, what does that mean to be a social animal? It means that we are meant to be together. We do not like being alone. Very few people like true isolation. Again, we like sometimes getting away from people, chilling a bit, but then getting back to people, especially people with whom we have affection. So you think of getting together with friends and family, that's a fun time. And then it's just a question of how much time do you want to spend with them. But again, Maslow's calling this a need, the idea that we have this idea of belonging, that we should be with other people. And I'm not totally sure that he's wrong, because when you do look at the creation mandate, it does strictly say from God himself, it is not good for man to be alone. Now, it doesn't say it's not possible, but he says it's not good. So it's something that, for man's best, mental health, spiritual health, to not be alone. So then the idea of love, again, can you get through life without love? Yeah, you could. So as far as survival, I think I disagree with him here. But obviously, love is an important thing. I mean, when you, again, go to 1 Corinthians 13 in Scripture, it talks about faith, hope, and love. And the most important one of these is love. So it's critically important for the human being, especially talk about belonging, talk about not being alone. Love is that final step of togetherness and longing to be with the other person, that you can't imagine life without that person. That's love. So again, is this something that we absolutely need? No. Is it something that is fantastic for our mental health, spiritual health, etc.? Absolutely. I mean, so that'd be an interesting thing that you could wrestle with, the idea. Now, self-esteem and self-actualization, again, this is one of those things of, who do I think I am and what can I go out and do? Those things, again, are those needs. I mean, you can wrestle with Maslow on this one as well, because again, when you look at self-esteem, how do you think about yourself? How do you feel about yourself would be better for self-esteem. And if you're alone, and do you have to have good self-esteem, bad self-esteem? If you're just like, I've got food, clothing, shelter, I'm good to go there. I don't need much more beyond that, do I? And so is self-esteem, how you feel about yourself, really all that important, or is that just something that just kind of runs parallel with, and that's an interesting thought exercise. When it comes to how I feel about myself, is that something that I need, or is it just something that just kind of is there? Because there are days when you wake up, you feel better about yourself, and sometimes you will feel worse, but your overall feeling, that's your self-esteem. And self-actualization, the idea that can you go out and do the things that you want to do, the things that you're meant to do, the things that you're called to do, can you go do those things, and is this a need, and I would say in this one probably not, because quite frankly, we get sidetracked and derailed all the time, and life doesn't end. It's not like if you stop breathing, life ends. if you stop, having everything work out the way that you would hope it and plan it to be, that life ends. It might feel that way sometimes, and usually when people become depressed and even have suicidal ideations, they think that I don't like my self-esteem, I don't like my self-actualization, I don't like how I feel about myself, I don't like where my life has gone and where it looks like it's going, but those are choices. Those aren't things that your life will by nature end if those aren't working out well for you. So those are things for how Maslow broke down and looked at some different concepts of how he viewed needs. And again, growth needs, deficiency needs, those are things that we can wrestle with, especially on the growth needs side of things. So when it comes down to the last one, rights. What are rights then as compared to needs? Well, these are innate, and which means they're inside you. As a human being, you have these. And they, especially, the way I view it, the way our founding fathers viewed it, is that they're God-given. They're not given to you by another person. They're not given to you by a government or some other entity. They're part of who you are as a human. So you have a God-given right to speak. So you look at our First Amendment, you have the right to speech, the right to the right of press, so the right to report on things that you see, not the right to be a journalist, that's something different. The right to report on things you see, that's the press. You have the right to petition the government. You have the right to us peacefully assemble, and you also have the right to religion. So those are things that you have. They're just naturally within you. You have that right. And then the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. You have the right to defend yourself. You don't have to be a victim. You have the right to defend yourself. So, and then all the other ones that exist that are in our Bill of Rights. But again, so what does it make? What makes it a right, though? And, and this is where people get in trouble again when you see them protesting, saying, "I want, a right to this, a right to that." One that's very common you'll see is healthcare is a right. Well, that sounds like a very important thing because being healthy is important. Because we talked about the idea of being, if you don't have food, if you don't have water, if you don't have air, if you don't have sleep, you'll die. So healthcare should be kind of important, right? Well, the only problem with healthcare, first of all, you don't have the right of good health. Nobody has that. I mean, just things happen to us as they happen, and how God ordains that. But you don't have a right to have a perfectly healthy life. I'll never stub my toe, clear the other side. I'll never have cancer and anything in between. You don't have a right to that. That's not guaranteed. But healthcare is how you are treated by medical professionals to keep your health going in a good way. Well, what's the problem that you can sense when you hear that idea? For that to happen, I need someone else to be a doctor, which means if I have a right to healthcare, someone has to be a doctor. How does someone become a doctor? Well, they choose to be a doctor, and they want to be a doctor, or they're compelled to be a doctor. Well, what happens if I turn something into a right and that person's not there? Someone has to be forced into doing it. What do we call it when we force somebody to provide labor? That's called slavery. So you can see the difference when you start moving into these idea of rights when actually it's a want. I want healthcare. I pay my healthcare premium every month to make sure I get healthcare in case I ever need it. But it's one of those things that, if you want to be treated by a doctor, there has to be a doctor. There has to be a nurse. There has to be an x-ray technician. There has to be a phlebotomist. There has to be all these different people that do what they do. They have to be there. And if they're not there or no one's providing that service, someone has to be made to do it. You can't force people. So I don't have a right to this one thing or that thing or another thing. Sometimes you'll see people talking about, I need a right to housing. Says who? There's no right to that. Now, do you need shelter? Yes. A tent is shelter. Do you need a house? How big of a house? What kind of a house? Where's that house located? All that kind of stuff. That's not a right. That's wishful thinking. I mean, yeah, let's get one on the mountaintop overlooking the valley. I can see the sun come up and sip my coffee on the front porch. great. But I have a right to that. That's a wishful thinking sometime. That's a want. If I have a right to that, someone has to build it. And if there's no builder hand nearby, someone has to be forced to build it. And who's going to pay for it? Well, if it's a right, it means I don't have to pay for it. Someone else should be paying for it. Well, no one works for free. So you're going to force that person to work for free to build my house or to do my health care or to do whatever the other thing is. We're talking slavery at this point. So keep in mind, anytime someone says a right, if it's a service that's being offered to them or a product to be offered to them, that's where you should pump the brakes, because I have the right to bear arms, but there's no right that someone buys me a gun. I have to buy my own. I have the right to religion, but someone's not going to build me a church. I have to find one or build my own. It's one of those things that if someone else has to be compelled to do it, it's no longer a right. It's most certainly in the realm of want. And usually what people are saying when they say, I want a right to this, they say, I want this. I want this with minimal cost or no cost because I want it. So I want free food. I want free healthcare. I want free housing. I want free whatever. Want. It's not a right, because again, you're forcing other people to do it, and you're forcing them to do it for, ideally for you for free. And if you're not paying for it and they're not paying for it, someone else is going to pay for it. So you're forcing people to do work that they were not contracted to do. And you're using other people's resources to do it. So at the very least, it's slavery, but it's also theft. And you're compelling people and using coercion to do it. And that, of course, is what you hear when you hear about the communist utopia. That's the end result right there. So we don't want to have that kind of a thing. And you don't want to fall into that thing of thinking something is your right just because you want it. So needs, wants, rights, survival, desires, what's been God-given to you. And all three are different, and it's good to know the distinctions between them. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to comment too. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.